I suppose if I was anesthetizing robots, I could dial a number and put it in and it would work for all the robots. But when you're dealing with human beings, they're not all the same, even if they look the same.
It would be a piece of cake to do an anesthetic if the input to the central nervous system was always the same, but it's not. So every time the surgeon does something, it changes. And of course, depending on what analgesic dose we're giving, it changes. That may or may not blunt input. If we give a local anesthetic, that's going to change the input. So the amount of propofol that you need to produce sleep will be very different. And that's why I think that any kind of technique that states a dose, give 1 MAC of anesthesia, or always give this dose or this concentration of propofol, is just going to fail in a lot of patients. It's simply not going to you can't get around the fact that you have to titrate to effect.
I think to a certain extent even today, many of my colleagues in anesthesia believe that the drugs we use have a wide therapeutic window and that you can just get anywhere in that mid-range and you're fine. It doesn't matter if you give a little too much or a little too little, that there's a broad range of okay depth of anesthesia. And that interpatient variability, the difference between you and I, for instance, is fairly narrow in compared to that wide range, so that it's easy to put any of us in that range. What we're finding more and more is that the exact opposite is true. We're finding out that there is such a thing as too little anesthesia and that light end isn't quite as forgiving as we thought. And now Terry Monk's data and the other people looking at mortality and morbidity and outcome data is suggesting that maybe it's not so easy to go deep and not do any harm, that there may be risks in being too deep. And so you move the low end limit up, you bring the high end limit down, and you've begun to limit the true target range of right gas depth or right drug concentration to produce just right anesthesia. And then what we find out is that interpatient variability is much wider than we originally thought, that the differences from person to person can be tenfold. And so the real story is that you've got a range that's this wide and an interpatient variability that's this wide, so there's no hope of picking any right number and making sure that everybody is in range to be in the right range to have an optimal anesthetic, unless you can measure interpatient variability, and unless you can measure the difference between what you need and what I need on an individual basis. Hence, the need, I think, for a monitor like BIS to be able to tell you how much this individual patient needs to be able to keep it in that optimal range, which we now find to be a lot smaller than we originally thought.